All right, so moving along here in Thomas Pynchon's great first novel, V. I want to take a look at the way the novel is structured first. I didn't do this yesterday, and I should have. Regarding the table of contents, as I say, there are 16 chapters plus an epilogue, and so that makes the epilogue more or less chapter 17. And I noticed that I've read this now probably 4 or 5 times. I've noticed that it's only the odd-numbered chapters which contain stories about V, which is an interesting inversion of the fact that in Pythagorean number symbolism, the odd numbers are masculine and the even numbers are feminine. But it's only in the odd-numbered chapters, with one exception, chapter 14, that stories regarding V are recounted. And the first will be in chapter 3, not this one that we'll talk about right now, the very short chapter 2, very short and deceptively simple, as we'll see. In chapter 3, she first appears as Victoria Wren. So the father of Herbert Stencil, who is the counterfoil figure to Benny Profane. Benny Profane essentially represents, as we said last time, the avatar of post-modernity, whereas Herbert Stencil represents modernity, modernism. His career gets going in the year 1922. His father, Sidney, who had worked as a spy for the British Foreign Office, and who had an affair actually in 1898 with Victoria Wren, who then may be Herbert Stencil's mother. We don't know for sure. He just knows his mother is unaccounted for and missing, and his relationship with his father, who died in 1919 on the island of Malta, which, as we have seen, is very important for its Neolithic goddess tombs, and also for the fact that Palameistral comes from there. And a couple of years later, in 1922, then Herbert Stencil inherited his father's estate, and it's a collection of manuscripts that contains one line about V that refers to this affair to Victoria Wren here. And then, so then she appears in chapter 5 as Veronica the Rat, and the names always mean things in Pynchon. Veronica means the true icon, the Vera icon, the true icon, but not as a rat. And the rat, so far as I know, has no association with the archetype of the goddess whatsoever. Then again in 7, which deals with where she appears as Victoria Wren once again a year later in 1899. Herbert Stencil himself is born in 1901, and he's referred to in this chapter as the century's child. So he's the 20th century's child who is looking for its mother. In other words, the mother of this degenerate century of world wars, ethnic cleansing, and the atom bomb. This is the mother of the century, if he is the incarnation of modernity, modernism. So all this is tied in together. But this chapter in chapter 7, which is subtitled She Hangs on the Western Wall, refers to a plot to kidnap Botticelli's Birth of Venus. And so there it is again, V as Venus, the goddess of love, from the Uffizi in Florence. And then she appears again, another story in chapter 9, which is set in 1922 in South Africa, where she appears as Vera Meroving. And as the years go on, she begins to appear with more and more inanimate body parts. In this chapter, she appears first with a glass eye. That's her first inanimate aspect to her. Although her sister, in 1898, it's mentioned that she had a sister, Mildred, who's a rock collector. So once again, an association with the inanimate. But it has not yet invaded her soma in 1898, which is the earliest and as far back as she goes. And so 1922, chapter 9, in South Africa, which is associated with ethnic cleansing and genocide in that chapter, and is one of the best written chapters in the book. That chapter in and of itself is a masterpiece. Then we have her in chapter 11, 1943, on Malta as what is known as the Bad Priest, where she's got all kinds of prostheses. Her descent into the inanimate is complete at that point. And Palameistral is there as a little girl who is one of the group of kids who disassemble her body and pull apart all the inanimate objects. Her glass eye, which is painted with a clock face on it, and references to clocks, as we'll see, first appear in chapter 2 here. It's very important to keep track of these references. And then Now there's a break. Not chapter 13, but chapter 14, she reappears in the story V in Love, which is set back in 1913 now in Paris, where she's just known as the Lady V. We don't know her name there. And then not in 15 or 16, but then again in the epilogue, which is 17, basically set in the year of his father Sidney's death in 1919. Sidney Stencil, remember, was a spy and it was connected with the Fashoda crisis, and knew the character named Bongo Shaftesbury, who appears in Pynchon's story Under the Rose, which is the seed from out of which this novel grew. And Bongo Shaftesbury was Sidney Stencil's rival, as they were both spies, one for the British government, one for the French. And then, I believe, and then, Veronica Manganese is the name that she has in the 1919 chapter in the epilogue. So that's all what should be kept in mind with regard to this story. So, moving on then to chapter 2. The thing about chapter 2 is that now it introduces time into the novel. And Pynchon has a very strong interest in physics. He majored in physics and engineering for at least a while, maybe only for a year, and then designed missiles, of course, as we have seen for Boeing. So he knows very well what he's doing. He's also already written a short story by this point called Entropy. So none of this is me projecting things into Pynchon. These are things that are actually there. I'm not pulling a stencil here. This is Pynchon. So the introduction of time. I think the first chapter then, by contrast with Benny Profane, introduces space as an element with Profane's nomadic wanderings. He's almost it's almost like Brownian motion with him, and he's just wandering around. So we have space there with Benny Profane, as well as nihilism and postmodern meaninglessness, and the dismantling of grand meta-narratives. And what Stencil is trying to do is to construct a grand unified narrative. He is the incarnation of modernism, of modernity. Now keep in mind that, of course, his father, Sidney Stencil, represents modernity phase 1. Phase 1, modernity can be divided into two separate epochs. Its first phase comes out of Paris also, as does the second. After the Haussmannization of Paris in the 1850s under Napoleon III and the Baron Haussmann, who redesigns the city for him. And then in the 1860s, it begins then with Baudelaire, his ultra-modern poetry and the paintings of Manet, which eliminate iconotypes such as biblical myths and Greek myths, continuing in the French Revolutionary tradition of eliminating iconotypes by introducing the metric system, and eliminating all references to Greek and Christian myths. So that's modernity phase 1, but modernity phase 2 gets going, of course, with Picasso and James Joyce. Ulysses is published in 1922, the year that Herbert Stencil inherits his father's collection of manuscripts, which contain references, the first references that he finds to V. And there are two different types of time there to take in mind. Time first enters into physics with thermodynamics in modernity phase 1, where it enters in connection with the idea of entropy, where times arrow is introduced, which previously in Newtonian physics, times arrow had been a negligible quantity. It was irrelevant toward the vectorial XYZ phase space, where all operations were theoretically reversible. Not so once thermodynamics in modernity phase 1 introduced time and times arrow and the irreversibility of entropy into systems, and then the apocalyptic idea in physics began to emerge of the eventual heat death of the universe. And so then the second temporal dimension appears in modernity phase 2 with Einstein's unified field theory, of course, where time becomes the fourth dimension unified with the three dimensions of space, and so we have the four-dimensional spatio-temporal continuum. So that's time under modernity phase 2. So then there's that. And so this chapter 2, is very short. It's just subtitled The Whole Sick Crew, and it's broken into 3 different scenes, although only 2 are demarcated by Roman numerals, 1 and 2, and then the third does not have a Roman numeral for some mysterious reason, but there are 3 different scenes. And now, in the first scene, Rachel Owlglass now, whom we met as Benny Profane's girlfriend, Profane does not appear in this chapter. This is a stencil chapter. We first meet him in this chapter at a party. And Rachel Owlglass now is going to Dr. Schoenmaker, whose name, of course, means the beautiful maker because he's a plastic surgeon. And we will see him do a nose job on Esther Harding in chapter 3. Schoenmaker is Pynchon's the first of his mad scientists, let's put it that way. Gravity's rainbow is chock full of them. Schoenmaker is the first of his crazy scientific individuals. And so Esther is Rachel Owlglass's roommate, along with Paula Meistrel now, who's living with her. And Rachel is going to pay her bill. Rachel has money. Pynchon doesn't specify from where. And she's going to pay $800, which I'm not sure what that is in 1955, for her nose job, because Esther is Jewish and she has a large nose, and she thinks that it needs to be changed and gotten rid of. So now she can have the surgery once it's paid for by Rachel, who then, as she's waiting in Schoenmaker's waiting room, then we get the first reference to time. We have a clock. So Pynchon goes to great lengths. He spends 2 full long paragraphs describing this machine. And the clock is a double-faced clock, apparently, where one of the faces outward, and behind it is a mirror, and there's another face behind it for some reason, 2 faces, and one of them is mirrored in the mirror, and then it's surrounded with golden flying buttresses, which refers undoubtedly to Lewis Mumford's idea in Technics and Civilization, which is the first great book on technology ever written, to him finding out, Mumford did, and I'm sure Pynchon's read him, that the first mechanical clocks were invented by Gothic monks right around the year 1200, somewhere right in there. Hence the reference to why Gothic flying buttresses are associated with this double-faced clock that does not have a pendulum. Instead, it has a dial, a round disc, not a dial, a round disc that's parallel with the floor. So it's horizontal. And on it are 2 little demons doing a kind of dance back and forth. So that, and Pynchon says, you can see that the one clock face that has time going forward, but on the other, time is then reversed, as though the 2 then, because of the mirror, cancel each other out, which must then be a reference to the idea of the perpetual motion machine and its impossibility, of course, but it was a metaphysical idea that these monks invented, Vitello, I think, and Petrus Peregrinus, in the 14th century, after the clock is already invented. And the first clocks, by the way, did not have faces on them. They were just wound up for sound so that the monks would be on time for their prayers. And Pynchon says that the reflection then cancels them out. And a perpetual motion machine then is a metaphysical idea. It's not a possible idea, because the moment you embed such an idea in the physical world, you always have to deal with friction. You always have to deal with the dissipation of lost energy. And the idea to defend against entropy would be a closed system in which the energy always gets recirculated and never dissipates. It would just keep going around and around and around, as these monks thought maybe that the creation of the universe by God was a kind of giant perpetual motion machine that was given an initial kick, hence the impetus theory of Burden, that given an initial kick that set it into motion forever. And there must be a way, then, these monks thought, to create such a machine that would not need constant influx of new energy, such as winding mainsprings or the pendulums and so forth, but could be a perpetual motion machine. So we have the birth of the clock idea here in this first clock reference, that, and this chapter has 3 of them, that we first see in Dr. Schoenmaker's office when Rachel Owlglass goes in to sit down. And the owl, by the way, is also associated with the goddess. I remember that. The owl is an underworld animal, and the owl goddess with her death gaze is associated, goes all the way back. It was traced by Maria Gimbutas, actually, in her wonderful books on the civilization of the goddess and the language of the goddess, back into the Neolithic, where the stare of the owl goddess is associated with death. So she is Rachel Owlglass, and she gets into an ironic and sarcastic conversation with the doctor, whom she does not like. And the doctor thinks that she is referring to Lamarck's theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which is again a reference to time, in this case evolution. in which the doctor mistakenly says that the theory should be that if you cut the tails off of mice, then the descendants of the mice will be minus the tails. That's a caricature of Lamarck's theory. That's not the actual theory. But he thinks Rachel is talking about doing these nose jobs on people could impact them in such a way as to give their offspring damaged or altered noses. He might be altering the gene pool. That's what he thinks she's saying. And she isn't. She's just being a smartass. And she just doesn't like him. Such doctors usually aren't very likable individuals. There's always something unpleasant about such creepy mad scientist guys. And so she leaves after the bill is paid. She goes home to the apartment that she shares with Palomaestral and Esther. And Esther, by the way, means Easter. Easter, so we got the reference to Christmas Eve as the novel opened up. And hence note that too is the inversion of Herbert Stencil, where Herbert Stencil has the missing mother, but he knows very well who his father is, whereas on Christmas Eve we have the birth of the Christ child from the mother and the absent father. So it's inverted. And we got the reference to New Year's Eve, and now with Esther we have the reference to Easter and the resurrection idea. She goes back to the apartment to take a shower, and then she comes out of the shower, and we get the second reference to a clock, where she's coming into near Paula's bed is an illuminated electric clock now. So this clock is electric, but it has a dial face on it where the hands are at exactly 6 o'clock. And they're at 6 o'clock, and then Pynchon says, so it's 6 o'clock in the evening, she's getting ready to go to this party that the whole sick crew is throwing, and he sort of thinks of the clock perfectly neatly divided by the hands at 6 o'clock as each side being symmetrical with the other, almost like the double clock that we saw that was mirrored in the mirror as symmetrical, although in this case he mentions that but soon the hand passed 12 and began its course down the other side of the face as if it had passed through the surface of a mirror and had now to repeat in mirror time what it had done on the side of real time. So once again, we get the symmetry idea, but this is an electric clock now. We're in modernity. This is the age of electricity that has come in and replaced what is mentioned immediately in the next paragraph, which is Roman numeral 2, where Pynchon compares the party to another clock. He says, the party, as if it were inanimate after all, unwound like a clock's mainspring. And so that's an old-fashioned mechanical clock, but nonetheless, a mainspring, you have to wind it. It's not a closed system. It's subject to entropy. So once it has uncoiled, it's thermodynamic equilibrium until you put new energy into the system to wind it back up. So now we have the reference to entropy and the concept of things potentially running down. Then we meet Herbert Stencil himself. He was born in 1901, so he's in his mid-50s. He's 55-ish. And Esther has invited him to the party. And just on a hunch, she thinks maybe he should meet the whole sick crew and see if there's someone there, some clue. He's on a quest to discover V and who V was and whether she might be his mother. He's not sure. So we meet him and we find out details about his life and his father that we've already just gone over. The father dying in 1919, and then in 1922 he inherits his father's estate. And under the heading Florence, April 1899, is a sentence. Young Stencil has memorized it. Quote, "There is more behind and inside V than any of us had suspected." The father's referring here to Victoria Wren, with whom he had an affair, and V might indeed be Stencil's mother. Not who, but what. What is she? That's a reference to her descent into the inanimate. God grant that I may never be called upon to write the answer, either here or in any official report. Sounds like something out of a Lovecraft story, that sentence, with its melodrama. God grant that I ever be forced to confess these horrific things. And we know that Pynchon has read Lovecraft because there are references to him later on in the book. And then so Stencil has a memory of a meeting that he had with this woman in 1946. And they're on the island of Mallorca, Majorca was taken from the Moors in the 13th century, somewhere in there. It might have been 1209 or 1285. I forget. It's in the 13th century. And he has just returned from Toledo, and Toledo was taken from the Moors in 1085, shortly after the First Crusade. So he's just returned from Toledo to Majorca, and he's talking to this, apparently an aristocratic woman at her villa. And her name is Margravine de Chiave Lowenstein. Lowenstein means the hold or keep of the lion. And the whole name means the woman who holds the key to the lion's cage. And the lion has an ancient association with the goddess, going all the way back to Inanna, who always appears, who is the prototype for Venus, by the way, who always appears and is associated with the planet Venus, with the lion, as does Ishtar, as does Cybele, as does Shiva's wife Parvati. They're all associated with lions. So the lion goddess, he's having a conversation here with the lion goddess, and he tells her that for some funny reason, he refers to himself in the third person, which reminds me of the one Seinfeld episode where they make fun of a character who's always referring to himself in the third person. And she says he has done some spy work as well, just like his father did for the British government. She says, "You're so close." And he says, "To whom?" And she says, "A woman." He says, "Another woman, not you, another woman. It is she you are pursuing, seeking?" And Stencil says, "You'll ask next if he believes her to be his mother." But then it says, it must be in his head, he says, "The question is ridiculous." Pynchon writes this out as a dialogue, like a little bit of a play, just for a couple of lines. So he's in pursuit of of who might be his mother. But the main thing is that she's the symbolic mother of the catastrophes of the 20th century, the rise of the inanimate, the rise of modernism, phase two, that Stencil, with his construction of grand meta-narratives, and modernity is the great age. It is the climax of the construction of grand meta-narratives. So she's his mother, even if it's slightly too early for the affair taking place in 1898, and he's born in 1901, for him to be born from that affair. Nonetheless, she is the symbolic mother of modernity, modernism, and all the good things that go with it, and the bad things as well. And this, it says, has given him an acquired sense, finding her has given him an acquired sense of animateness, where she personifies the inanimate and the descent of the muse of the West into the inanimate, which has transformed civilization. And Pynchon's implication is that the descent into the inanimate, into the machine, is what has caused the coldness and cruelties of the West. I remember Marshall McLuhan saying somewhere that you could ask a pilot to pour gasoline on a child's head and light it on fire. Pretty sure he won't do it. But if you put him in a bomber plane, put him up in the air, he'll do it merrily and happily. Machines numb human contact. They numb, they distance, they act as buffers that numb human emotion, human feeling, and human contact. If you turn the corner and you bump into somebody, you say, "Oh, excuse me, sorry, I didn't see you there." But when you're in traffic in a car and somebody cuts you off, you honk at them, you hurl curses at them. This is Pynchon's point in this novel, that technology, even though he is himself a designer of machines, may not be such a good thing, and may actually be what's responsible for the incredible atrocities and cruelties of the 20th century. Okay, so then he's standing there by himself, all these young kids around, some of them are making out, and he starts to decide that it's time to leave. And then we meet some of the Holsick crew, which is Pynchon's parody on 1950s Greenwich Village, and artists like the abstract expressionists and so forth. Fergus Mixolydian is one of them, and as his name, Mixolydian, suggests, he's an Irish Armenian Jew and universal man who is probably the laziest living being in New York. He actually, instead of bothering to create a work of art, he actually removed the wall of a men's stall at Penn Station and put it into an art exhibition as a ready-made. Didn't have to put any effort into it at all. And of course, it's Pynchon making fun of Duchamp's urinal and the concept of the ready-made, which can be seen as a cop-out. Possibly. It is and it isn't. It all depends on who we're talking about here, what Duchamp did by introducing the ready-made. He was a frustrated painter. He started as a painter, and when he painted this wonderful painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, nobody gave a shit about it, so he gave up on painting and instead turned around and invented the ready-made, that which is just, you take a bicycle tire and put it on exhibition on a seat, in the urinal, of course. But Fergus is so lazy now that the only way, Pynchon has a great joke here, he says, the only way you can tell if this guy's awake or not, he was doing an experiment where he was making hydrogen to put in a balloon. And hydrogen, by the way, which is extremely flammable, was used initially for dirigibles before helium. And Americans had a monopoly on helium, and the Nazis could not get it for the Hindenburg, which is one of the reasons why it blew up, because it was powered by hydrogen. So he's putting hydrogen into this balloon with a Z painted on it, and when he's ready to go to sleep, he ties it to his bedpost so that you'll know he's snoozing. This is how lazy the guy is. And then he's also so lazy that he contrives to connect himself to his television by planting electrodes in his arm that switch it off for him once he starts falling asleep. The electrodes pick up that he's falling asleep and switches off the TV for him. This is before the days of the remote control. So he's the laziest man in New York. And don't forget, Pynchon wrote an essay on sloth in a series of the cardinal sins that he did. So then we also have Raoul, who writes for television. And then we have Slab, who is a painter who calls himself a catatonic expressionist. And all he paints is a series of cheese danishes over and over and over again. Cheese Danish number 1, cheese Danish number 2. And he's been having an affair with both Esther and, I believe, Rachel as well. And then we have Melvin the guitarist. And then we have, okay, so that's the party. And Stenzel is bored and he leaves. He sees people pairing off, going into the back bedroom. He's like, I'm out of here. So he leaves. And then the third and final scene of the chapter takes place at a bar called the V-Note, where we have a jazz player who's one of the sick crew, I believe, named McClintock Sphere. Sphere was Thelonious Monk's middle name, but he is most likely modeled on Ornette Coleman. And here he is playing jazz, and Paula Maestral is out. At the moment, she's in the ladies' room, and then she's out with a couple of other sick crew members, Winsome and Charisma, and a guy named Fu, as in Fu Manchu. And they're all lamenting the loss of Bird, who had died, I believe, the year before, I guess in '54, Charlie Parker, Bird. And some of them say, he plays all the notes that Bird missed. And so that's where the chapter closes. And this is Pynchon introducing us both to Herbert Stenzel and setting us up for Esther's nose job in the next chapter and introducing us to the whole sick crew.